Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Monday, December 9th, 2024, and today we'll discuss my trip to Maryland. We'll talk watermelons and profit a bit more and ask the question, does KNF or JADAM or biodynamics have any science behind it? So let's do it. All right, so first off, apologies for all the gaps in the show. I hope you YouTube crowd enjoyed the talk on the 4 types of compost that I put up yesterday from the Kentucky Composting Conference back in October. I will link that in the show notes for any of you who didn't see it. But anyway, I am back and ready to roll after a few days in Maryland and Washington, D.C. I had a blast. First of all, as far as cities go, Washington, D.C. is wildly beautiful. I mean, I'd heard about the cherry blossoms in the spring and all that, but I was blown away with that city in general, the design, the trees, all the things. I had a lot of work to do while I was there, and I actually have a biochar video coming for you this upcoming Sunday, I think. Shout out to the guys at FOOP for that. But that area has so much going on. I would love to explore some of the urban and peri-urban farming a bit more the next time I go, more than I got to this time. When I arrived, I stopped at an El Salvadorian place and grabbed some delicious pupusas and got to take in the sights of the city from my rental car a bit before heading to my hotel to do some work. Then the next day, I headed to a small event hosted at Deep Roots Farm in Maryland, where I got to meet roughly 15 farmers from the area, which included my buddy Nazirak Amen, who sent me home with some of the best oats I've ever eaten. Huge shouts to Nazirak for that and all of his work. It was a cold, blustery day, but I had a lot of fun. Massive thank you to the American Farmland Trust and Future Harvest for organizing the event. I will notably not be doing really any more conferencing this winter, except I will be moderating a talk at the Oak Organic Association of Kentucky conference in January with 4 presenters. That would be Marissa Arnold-Dusen of the Organic Association of Kentucky, Daniel Mays of Frith Farm, Margaret Shea of Dropseed Native Plant Nursery, and Ian Zeglin of Green Acres Foundation. That should be super nerdy and fun. That is an amazing group. I'll link it in the show notes as well. So why am I not doing any more events this year? Well, this daily show, for one, I'm frankly just enjoying doing this show kind of on its own. It's a brutal amount of work, don't get me wrong, and my brain has absolutely never been so challenged, but it's a lot of fun. But it is also, however, impossible to take this kind of show on the road for the moment. Maybe in the future, I'd love to do some remotes, but we're not quite there yet. Also, I'm not doing more conferences this season because, I mean, honestly, I just don't love being away from my family and having cool experiences like DC and those delicious pupusas and hanging out with all those farmers on my own. Not super enjoyable to have an experience that you share with literally nobody. And of course, it's not economically feasible to take them everywhere with me, my family that is. There's also the environmental cost of travel. I remember Wendell Berry once saying, quote, seems to me that for 35 or 40 years, I've been flying about all over the country to tell people, in effect, that they ought to be staying home, end quote. And I feel that. I'm trying to reduce my time in the air a bit more. Rather, I'd like to concentrate those times that I do fly and accomplish more in those events. Now, I'm definitely not complaining. It's a very cool thing I get to do, 100%, but even great and enjoyable opportunities should be weighed against all of your values. It's like that thing we talked about that one day, probably on the show, with having a decision-making framework. You need a test you can run things through, even cool things, to see if they actually get you closer to where you want to go. For me, it's all about my farm, my family, my community, and my relationships anymore. I know people who do tons of conferencing. I've even heard some speakers refer to it as the circuit. But they are also spending like days and weeks away from their kids. I'm not judging them. That's their choice, but because they can, make a living and, support their family. But I just don't want to miss these years with my kiddos or with my wife. So anyway, changing subjects by approximately 1,000%, give or take. One thing I want to touch on later this week is the H5N1 bird flu. I would like to hear from any raw milk producers specifically. Have you been contacted by the CDC or anyone yet? Have your customers reached out about it? I'm very curious about this. Every 5 or so years, a pathogen with pandemic potential pops onto the scene. Well, that's some good alliteration. And H5N1 bird flu is our newest, so that's exciting. And being a small farm podcast and bird flu being currently a disease thriving on farms, I thought it wouldn't hurt to at least check in with you all. I know that disease control on a national level has become quite fraught. I mean, I would be lying if I said I wasn't at least a little hesitant to even mention it for what it's going to do to my beloved comment section. But it's a bit like in sports where when something goes wrong, if you don't get over it and prepare yourself for the next play, the game is only going to get worse. That's not a very good analogy to just say, I worry we're not prepared for another disease like this to let loose because of how the last one went. Anyway, we'll talk more about bird flu later this week. For now, let's take a little break, and when we come back, we'll talk about researching exceedingly contextual agricultural methods, because that's kind of our thing. BRB. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Tilth Soil. Tilth Soil is a worker-owned co-op in Cleveland, Ohio, making NOP-compliant living soils for organic growers. Everything from Tilth is compost-based, and they divert around 4,000 tons of food scraps from landfills each year. I have used Tilth Soil for several years now for my plant starts. I love the results. I get consistent germination and consistent growth, plus excellent customer support. It's a lovably nerdy cast of folks who run Tilth. So, start your season with excellent germination and strong transplants. Check out Tilth's pre-sale pricing for the 2025 season at tilthsoil.com. That's tilthsoil.com, and click Farmers. All right, back to the show. If you, the listener, are enjoying this podcast and would like to support it, you can do so over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I try to get to questions from everywhere, as you know, but I will always get to those Patreon questions. Today's question comes from Patreon member Chris Smith, who writes, quote, "Hey Jesse, thanks for answering my question from last month's thread." Again, like I said, I get to those Patreon questions. Chris writes, "I understand there is a decent amount of information in books on less academic topics like biodynamic preps, Korean natural farming, JADAM, etc., but I was wondering how much of these topics are explored in the scientific literature. Any recommendations on where to look, read would be appreciated." End quote. Great question. And the short answer is that yes, all of these practices have been explored in research to some extent. But when you're exploring practices that cannot be standardized because they encourage the grower to do their own preparations, things do get a bit wonky. To back up, JADAM and Korean natural farming, which I will refer to as KNF from here on out, are both branches of the same proverbial tree. Effectively, they are both Korean-born practices that are focused on producing one's own amendments from what is already around you locally instead of buying in fertilizers and etc. Biodynamics is similar in that way, but it is more about treating the whole farm like a living organism and using the specific preparations to maximize or encourage different growth. It's also quite esoteric and full of mysticism, biodynamics is, so watch the videos I did with Jeff Poppin to learn more about those practices. I'll link those in the show notes along with Jeff's new book. I love Jeff. He's a mentor of mine, and he kind of breaks these things down really simply. All of these practices are organic practices and could be certified as long as you follow the National Organic Program guidelines. Now, a lot of the research on KNF is in Korean, or that's my understanding. It's hard to tell from here as a non-Korean speaker how much research that actually constitutes overall, but there is some research in English, and the results are about what you would expect, I guess, from such individualized practices. They're generally positive, sometimes no results, and occasionally negative, but generally positive. Hawaii's done the most research, as far as I can tell, on KNF, and that is in English, and I'll link a little bit of that in the show notes. Chris Trump has also done a lot of great work with KNF in America and knows the research far better than I do, certainly. We talked a bit about it back in 2019 for a podcast episode that I'll link in the show notes as well. JADAM is a bit of an offshoot of KNF, literally created by the son of the KNF creator, but it is also its own thing. JADAM is arguably simpler, potentially cheaper, but I will go more into these practices all individually another time. Because although I've looked at that research, I mean, research papers, you really have to spend like several days on each one. And there are lots of new ones out there. Between those two, JADAM and KNF, the JADAM team is really savvy. They're great at sharing lots of information. Their website is rich with resources. There are multiple books on the subject. In effect, for JADAM, it's easy to get all of the details, but JADAM does not have a ton of English research behind it yet that I can find, but I only allot myself so much time for these episodes. So feel free to always share stuff you find or know of that I may have missed. And again, I will explore more in depth each one later on. KNF is slightly more studied, but the practices themselves are significantly less accessible in English literature than JADAM. There are just a couple of books, and I'll link those as well. All that to say, though, that the idea with all of these practices is generating the majority of the farm's fertility and sometimes the farm's pest and disease management on farm. So researching something like that is difficult because unlike chemical fertilizers and pesticides that are completely standardized and arrive in a bottle, the amendments in these practices are made on farm by different people in different climates with different materials. It's literally the point of them, that you can make the stuff that other people want to sell you using just what's around you. But scientifically speaking, their very nature makes them challenging to study. Now, biodynamics has the most scientific research of the three available. It's the oldest. As an organized practice, it's the oldest of them, but it has the most available in English, especially the reviews where they take a bunch of different papers and examine the findings to give you a general idea of how things like biodynamics work as a whole compared to both organic and conventional methods. I think those are really interesting. Those are largely positive as well, at least in terms of ecological benefits, and I will link one or two of those in the show notes for you as well. And that's not surprising. Even if the biodynamic preps did not do what they purport to do, it's still a dynamic organic practice, which in terms of soil health is generally going to yield better results. But sense does not make science, and sometimes science struggles with dynamic practices. Yeah. I would also be remiss to not mention that biodynamics creator Rudolf Steiner said some pretty problematic things back in the 1920s in Austria, which I think is just important context when deciding how to view his teachings. In an agricultural sense, though, I think it is important to keep in mind with any of these practices, they are just tools in a toolbox. In the same way, you need more than just a hammer to build a house. You need more than just a good microbial solution to build a productive garden. You need good water delivery, irrigation, and moisture retention, so mulches and just good soil practices. You need to address compaction. You need to keep the soil covered and planted and undisturbed as much as possible, right? Our conservation agriculture principles. These practices like JADAM, et cetera, all have their merits, and they are certainly all fun to engage with. I love playing with all of these methods. Again, if your neighbors don't think you're out of your mind, I think you're doing it wrong. But they work in concert with everything else you're doing. With emphasis, if you are not doing all the other stuff well, no single treatment is going to fully repair the soil on its own. Again, building healthy soil is like building a house, and a hammer alone won't really do the trick. At least not in any efficient amount of time. So, great question, Chris, and I hope I provided enough places to look for further reading on these subjects, but also I found some research I haven't yet had time to dive into, so I can continue on exploring some of the old and more recent research and keep you updated. I have to do one of these every day, so there should be plenty of time. So yeah, I will share more as I learn more, and listeners, please feel free to share any research you think is interesting as well. Up next, let's break down what profitability means a bit when it comes to watermelons. Yeah. Be right back. Okay, so last week at Lamb's Quarters Farms on YouTube asked a good question on Tuesday's episode after the segment I did on how watermelons were a crop I grow, but were not profitable. I calculate I would have to sell them at upwards of $75 a piece to earn what I earn on lettuce. Their question was, quote, I'm missing the $75 per watermelon price for profit breakdown, comparing to squash, vining, and space hog. They equal less bug pressure, shorter season. So what am I missing, which raises the work/cost, end quote. Okay, so great question. And I guess I didn't get into the details of that because I wasn't sure if I could make it interesting enough to watch or listen to. But let's give it a whirl and you all can tell me. So yes, squash. As I quipped at the end of that segment, squash is also not super profitable. But setting that aside for a second, let's focus on the $75 a melon thing. Remembering that space is valuable for me, or it has been historically, because space is limited on our farm and a lot of market gardens. If a bed of lettuce earns me $750 in one cutting, which doesn't include the second cutting, that would mean in order for the melons to earn me that same amount, and I get, let's say, 10 to 20 marketable melons off of a 50-foot bed, which is probably about right for seedless watermelons because you have to factor in space for the non-productive pollinator plants plus a couple losses and the one or two you have to eat. I mean, obligatorily. Can I say obligatorily? I don't know. maybe that's a word, then that is roughly $75 to $38 per melon, i.e. 10 to 20 melons off of a bed that I need $750 from, assuming no raccoons get savvy and start raiding the place. Keep in mind as well that I could grow about 1.75 rounds of lettuce in the same amount of time, or a lettuce and a radish round or whatever, which means that that bed is actually worth more like $1,100 to $1,400 for that same time period. Yeah, if we're just talking one crop and one harvest, somewhere between $38 and $75 is what I figure those melons need to earn, either of which are ludicrously high prices for normal-sized watermelons. Now, these are dry farmed melons, and some years they yield a little better for the rain, and I could generally irrigate them and plant them closer, maybe more densely. And who knows, maybe I could double my yield and get them a little closer to like $15 or $20. Feel free to let me know how many pounds or individual melons that you're able to yield off of 50 feet. Maybe my numbers are just wrong, or I'm just not a good melon grower. Entirely possible. Now, that $38 to $70 number is not the same as profit. We're talking gross revenue there. That is the amount of money before expenses. I have no idea how to make this interesting to listen to, but if you're still following, the expenses of lettuce will be higher because the cost of seeds, but also for things like Salanova especially, the amount of soil mix and the labor in planting them costs about $15 per bed to grow. Melons are more like $4 to $6 in upfront cost. That labor, seeds, materials, etc. Then they both have roughly the same amount of upkeep in my system because we don't generally have to cultivate any crop very often. But the melons are in the ground longer, so they often do need at least one good hand weeding or cultivation, depending on bed prep, how well I did there, or mulch, and etc. So you may have to add a couple bucks to the upkeep cost. Either way, it's still a little bit less than lettuces. The other thing you have to factor in with something like melons is that they're heavy and they take up a lot of room in the market truck or van or whatever. So where I can pack $250 worth of lettuce for market in a single large cooler, I can pack maybe 4 or 5 melons in the same space. And if I'm charging $8 or $10 a melon at market price, I don't know what melons are going for in your markets, but probably not much more than that in ours, depending on its weight. That may be, $40 in the same space I can cram $250 worth of lettuce. Also, I can harvest lettuce into a few bins all at once that I can carry or haul back by hand rather easily. Notably, some of my labor expenses are contextual, but I can't just pull up to the field and harvest directly into my market vehicle because of where my fields are. We have to harvest into bins or directly into the wheelbarrow and get them all the way to the market van, and then load them one by one, which is a lot of energy and labor on our end, usually rewarded with eating a melon, which just takes away from the profitability, but increases the deliciousability. Yeah. Now, I don't want to ignore the fact that lettuce also takes labor to both wash and pack. And so maybe in the end, this element is kind of a wash, and perhaps slightly less time in packing watermelons, though, of course, more labor, because again, they're heavy. Do watermelons technically make more than I spend to grow them? Yes, but I also need them to contribute to the overhead costs of running the farm, to pay rent, a term I am borrowing from other growers. This is where profitability gets complicated, more complicated. But essentially, it's more important than the amount a crop makes over what you spent on it, because this is the part that will determine if you, the farmer, make any money. I will go deeper on this idea of rent at some point, but basically one way we use to figure out what rent costs per bed is that we take our whole farm budget over the year, how much the farm costs to run, including market fees, labor expenses, utilities, all of that, and divide that by the number of growing beds. Then we can see how much a bed needs to earn beyond what that crop costs to produce. For an example, let's say you arbitrarily want your farm to earn $100,000 per year. Okay, now divide that number by the number of beds you have to work with. That's what each of those beds needs to earn you. If you have only 20 beds, you're probably like, oh dear. Now, if you make more than that number on a crop or certain crops, you can grow a few less profitable crops, but only within reason. If that number is $500 for the year per bed and the melon beds are only making you $150 for a long season, it's tougher to justify. Does that make sense? Is any of this interesting? I have no idea. But if you're still hanging in there, props. But now to the point about the squash also not being profitable, it depends on the squash and also when you plant it. But no, it is not that much more profitable than melons, especially pumpkins, which yield roughly the same as Lamb's Quarters Farm noted, more time to mature. But with the smaller squashes like honey nuts, they yield quite a bit better. What I like, though, about winter squash in comparison is that they are storable, so they give me a product over winter when it's hard to have a diverse offering. Winter squash like that, especially those smaller ones, is one I choose to grow that is less profitable because I follow my garlic with them. So by the end of the season, those beds easily make their rent. Because it's a garlic bed followed by a squash bed, garlic is pretty profitable. Now, I don't expect you to have gotten all of that in one listen, so I will try to go over these ideas in different ways over the years, presumably. Some people approach the idea of profitability differently. Feel free to share your thoughts or questions or critiques on anything I said today. I feel like it was like kind of a weighty episode. But the bottom line is just that when you're running a business, you have to make money. It's annoying. And watermelons aren't the best at doing that on a square foot basis, even if they are more delicious than most other things on a square foot basis. Maybe they would be on a larger scale where room isn't an issue and you could charge whole acres rent instead of beds. I don't know, but I hope that was at least interesting. And I fully plan on growing watermelons because they're delicious and I like juicing them and I like giving them to customers for all the reasons I said last week. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and to the team at No Till Growers for their support. Remember, there are discount codes over there at patreon.com/no-till growers if you need to do some last minute holiday shopping or some spring gear or seed shopping. Members can check those out. Also, I guess Apple is going to start taking a percentage of in-app purchases, like maybe this month, which also means memberships to sites like Patreon. So if you can sign up through the website instead of the app, or if you have an Android, that's better for everyone. Everyone except Apple, who frankly really suck for doing that. Anyway, you know who doesn't at all suck in any way, shape, or form? People who support us through patreon.com/no-till growers, because at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or if you just sign up in the month of December, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Raymond, Miriam Cantaloupe. Oh, that's a good name, Miriam. I mean, Miriam and Cantaloupe. These are just, it's like a double whammy. Robert, just the first name. Ranchito Milky Way. That is awesome. Is that a farm or is that a name? Maybe it's both. Kaylee Onstein, Robert Hyatt, Carly Bain, Sarah B, Sean Ueda, and that's the name. Great name. This to me is kind of a cartoon. I feel like this has got like a, let's just call it, it's got to be called Ranchito Milky Way, right? It's a space cartoon about sport, because, clearly Carly Bain is like the coach of a team of misfits, all from the planet O. And they're in a big space competition, and the sport is really complicated, and every time they leave their home planet, everybody on the home planet ages faster, so it's like really, it's an emotional roller coaster for them. But anyway, I'm not gonna spoil the ending, but let's just say they invade Earth. Let's just say it. That's what happens. That's what always happens. I don't know why they can't just stay in their own region. But Earthlings get to play, then there's like a whole competition between the Earth and anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye.